It all began with a whisper, a rumor about a horrifying discovery. The news spread like wildfire, carrying a paralyzing fear. A secret, hidden in plain sight, had come to light. A dismembered body, a shocking testament to human cruelty. The air was thick with unspoken tension. There was no escape from the grim reports, the stories of unexplained disappearances. Even the ancient temples, silent witnesses to centuries of history, seemed to sense the shift. Bangkok, a city pulsing with the rhythm of life, stood still in anticipation. Joyful laughter and the shouts of street vendors were replaced by anxious murmurs. The nightlife, once a symbol of the city's energy, had now become the backdrop for an unfolding tale of a serial killer with an iron chest, for the second time in its history. Over 100 years ago, Bangkok became the stage for a chilling drama, starring perhaps one of the most infamous serial killers in the country's history, Boon Peng Heap Lek, also known as Iron Chest Boon Peng. Masterfully playing the role of a monk, someone no one would ever suspect, he and his accomplices took lives, dismembered their victims, and disposed of their bodies in canals, rivers, and ponds, sealing them inside iron chests. Who would have thought that a century later, he would have a prolific successor, Apichai Ongwisit, who would earn a similar nickname, the Iron Chest? There is a saying that children pay for the sins of their fathers, and in this case, the phrase fits perfectly. Apichai was the grandson of the renowned Thai businessman Banthun Ongwisit. It was Banthun who made the family name famous, bringing it prestige. But unfortunately, he could not protect it from his own son and grandson. In Thailand, Banthun is considered a legend, especially among the older generation. He played a significant role in shaping the country's culture, giving a powerful boost to the film industry. After World War II, he wrote scripts, worked as a director, producer, and actor in various plays and films. With the wealth he accumulated, he invested heavily in commercial real estate, building theaters, a cinema, and a highly profitable shopping center, the Ongwisit Yambangkai Shopping Center. Sadly, Banthun's son, Chalermchai Ongwisit, inherited his father's fortune and properties, but not his passion for creation, leading to horrifying consequences. On a Friday in early October 1983, Bangkok police received a report about a mutilated body discovered in a drainage canal, stuffed inside a television box. Inside the box, only the torso remained. The killer had either cut off or hacked away the head and limbs, but the police quickly found them inside a suitcase abandoned on a road near a police station. Detectives traced the television box to the store that had sold it. It turned out that the buyer was Phayong Santhawi, the brother-in-law of Chalermchai Ongwisit. Phayong was brought in for questioning, where he confessed that he had found a dead 15-year-old girl in his apartment and disposed of the body. Officers searched his apartment, located inside a shopping center owned by the Ongwisit family. The place was spotless, shining with an artificial cleanliness. But the police weren't fooled. They dismantled the ceiling and water pipes and found a collarbone. It belonged to the same girl whose body parts had been dumped in the suitcase and TV box. The murder was now linked to Phayong's apartment, but was he really the killer? Phayong insisted that he was. He claimed that the girl had been a homeless troublemaker, causing mischief at the family's shopping center, banging on an expensive custom-made aquarium. When Phayong confronted her and told her to stop, she talked back to him. He lost his temper, dragged her into his apartment, and hit her. She fell, struck her head on the edge of a table, and died. Panicked, he got rid of the body, scattering the remains across Bangkok, using the car of his sister's husband, Chalermchai Ongwisit. Shockingly, Phayong confessed to the brutal murder almost immediately, but the police didn't believe him. At the very least, he had no idea where exactly he had disposed of the suitcase and the television box, and yet he insisted he had acted alone. But the investigators already knew who in the family had the kind of violent temper to kill a teenager over an aquarium, no matter how expensive it was. It was always Chalermchai who lost control, who picked fights with customers who had simply come to buy fish at his shopping center. Detectives invited Chalermchai to the station for questioning. He showed up but denied any involvement in the crime. The police had no solid evidence against him, so they had no choice but to let him go. However, literally the next day, Chalermchai was shot dead. Suspicion fell on his wife, but before investigators could question her, she fled the country, taking their younger daughter with her. She left behind her son, 4-year-old Apichai Ongwisit, in the care of his aunt, along with a small sum of cash. Little Apichai was left without a family in a vast, noisy city. Not much is known about his early years. His relatives apparently did not shower him with love, and he spent a lot of time on his own, wandering the streets alone. It's unclear what was going through his mind at the time, but as he grew older, he learned that his father, suspected of murdering a teenage girl, had been killed, likely by his mother, who had fled Thailand, taking only his younger sister with her. While this alone may not have determined what would happen later, it's hard to deny the impact such circumstances could have had on a child's psyche. At school, Apichai wasn't popular either. For one, of course, everyone knew about his family, and secondly, he was a rather frail boy, unable to stand up for himself. But don't rush to feel sorry for him, because Apichai came of age and inherited everything that was rightfully his, including the family mansion, which the locals had nicknamed the House of Horrors. The boy who had once been bullied by his peers transformed into a man ready to explode at any moment. And given that money can sometimes help one slip out of legal trouble, many of his misdeeds went unpunished. He became increasingly brazen until he finally crossed the line. In 2008, the 28-year-old man was arrested for assault. After serving 3 years in prison, he was released, only to be arrested twice the following year, once for illegal possession of firearms and again for the abduction of a 17-year-old girl. What's more, when the police came to his house, he tried to shoot his way out. Inside his mansion, authorities discovered a vast arsenal of weapons, both firearms and bladed weapons, along with handcuffs, bulletproof vests, tasers, and illegal substances that he had been selling. Apichai spent another 6 years in prison, but when he was released in 2018, he had no intention of learning from his mistakes, and he continued selling illegal substances, mixing them with caffeine. Why? Just because. It wasn't his only or even primary source of income. He still had the entire family fortune, including a building with 100 apartments that had always been in high demand and never stood empty, at least not until 2018, when Apichai was released from prison and started showing his true nature. Under the influence of illegal substances, he got into altercations with tenants. Not just fistfights, though. Apichai always carried a gun. Tenants began to fear him and quietly moved out. His neighbors weren't thrilled about their unpredictable neighbor either. They were scared not only of Apichai himself, but also of the horrors that took place on his estate. For instance, he began breeding predatory fish, like alligator gar, in the 3 ponds surrounding his mansion. When ordering pizza, he might fire a few bullets at the delivery driver just for fun. And if some unlucky driver happened to cross his path on the narrow road leading to his house, at best, Apichai would start shooting into the air. A real pleasant guy. No one knew how to stop him, and no one could have imagined that it would be his closest friend who would succeed in doing so. In prison, Apichai met a man named Chalamkon, who had been repeatedly arrested for crimes, mostly related to the distribution of illegal substances. The two men quickly found common ground, and after Chalamkon was released, he went straight to his friend, the one with money, drugs, and the ability to help him find work. Apichai hired him as a garden handyman. They soon became inseparable, spending every day together, both for fun and for their shady dealings. That was until January 2020, when Chalamkhan was arrested on charges related to illegal substances. It's worth noting that Thai authorities are extremely strict with those involved in this underground business. If it involves the most dangerous and potent of such substances, the punishment can be severe, up to and including the death penalty. It was no surprise that after getting caught red-handed, Chalamkhan was willing to do or say anything to avoid a lethal injection or reduce his prison sentence. He admitted that he worked as a guard at Apichai Ongvisit's house, something that immediately caught the officers' interest. They had long wanted to charge Apichai for producing illegal substances, but Chalamkhan didn't stop there. He revealed that he could provide information on an unsolved murder case, and that was an offer the officers simply couldn't refuse. Chalamkhan confessed that in 2019, he had helped Apichai bury a young woman's body near the pond behind his house, and in his opinion, it wasn't the first. On January 9, 2020, more than 24 officers arrived at the home of the influential heir. Another attempt by the man to offer armed resistance to the police failed. His gun jammed, and Apichai was brought down to the floor, naked, covered only by a towel. Meanwhile, at the location indicated by Chalamkhan, officers dug up a locked iron box. When it was opened, they found a woman's body inside. After that, Apichai stopped trying to hide and told the detectives the name of the girl, Warrenthorne Chayachet, affectionately called Nong Kukik, or simply Kik. Apichai was a regular at the nightclubs of Bangkok, and it was at one of these that he met 22-year-old Warrenthorne, or Kik, who worked there in 2019. It should be noted that Thailand is known for its adult entertainment industry, Although many of these activities are illegal by law, they remain extremely popular behind closed doors. And since they bring in a lot of money to the country, thanks to tourists, the authorities turn a blind eye to it. Therefore, it's easy to mistake the women working in Thai bars for night butterflies. Some may indeed be, but there are others whose job is simply to keep the visitors company, entertain them in the club, make them want to come back, and encourage them to order more drinks. This was Kik's job. She chose this line of work not out of choice. The girl had come to Bangkok from a small village in Thailand, where she had been raised by her loving grandmother. However, after her divorce from her husband, the family had no income. If the girl hadn't worked, her children would have had no roof over their heads. Needless to say, when the wealthy Apichai Ongbijit showed interest in her, Kik was glad to spend time with him. Apichai and Kik spent hours together at the club, drinking and getting to know each other better. Eventually, the girl began to stay overnight at his mansion. Whether she truly liked him or not, we will never know, but the situation suited both of them. However, Kik soon discovered that Apichai's inherited money was not his only source of income. The man not only sold illegal substances, but he also used them himself. Unfortunately, due to this, the already short-tempered Apichai became simply unbearable, jealous, controlling, and aggressive. To make sure Kik didn't talk to other men, he forced her to stay in his house most nights. Kik found herself between two fires. On the one hand, she continued working at the bar, but on the other, she didn't want to upset her boyfriend. She had to severely limit her interactions with other clients, which clearly upset them. It ended in July 2019 when Kik confessed to Apichai that she had been sexually assaulted by him. Although both she and Apichai went to the police, she didn't know or couldn't identify the perpetrator. The police, nevertheless, tried to find the criminal, and to do so, they needed to stay in touch with the victim. However, in August 2019, Kik suddenly stopped responding to all communications from the police. Her relatives could not get in touch with her either. After several days of silence, her family reported her disappearance. However, since she worked in the adult industry, the police weren't in a rush to seriously pursue her case. Unfortunately, this industry goes hand in hand with violence and murder, and since she was intentionally hiding in the shadows, it was incredibly difficult to get justice. The case was considered open, but very little progress had been made in trying to locate Kik, and so her body was found on the grounds of her boyfriend's house. At first, he tried to deny any involvement in the murder, but then changed his story, claiming it was an unfortunate accident. He supposedly loved her to death and didn't want to let her go. However, Kik had decided to return to her ex-husband, something Apichai couldn't tolerate. That's why he forced her to sleep in a small iron box that he kept at home. Night after night, he made her crawl into the tight box and sleep there. But one morning at the end of August 2019, he discovered that she had suffocated. Instead of calling an ambulance and trying to save his beloved, he called his friend and bodyguard, Kalamkhon, who helped him dig a grave for her. This is the story that Apichai Ongbijit told the police. But it had little to do with the truth, because Chalamchun got ahead of him, and his version of events seemed much more believable. Chalamchun had repeatedly witnessed Apichai beating Kik with a metal pipe and chaining her with handcuffs. The punishment could be for anything, even something as minor as Kik not finishing her food. He was also a witness to how Apichai made her sit in the tight box. Poor Kik would scream, and if her cries disturbed her boyfriend, he would simply turn up the music. But clearly, one night, Apichai went too far with the punishment. The autopsy revealed that before her death, Kik had been struck hard with a blunt object. Nearly all her large bones were broken, and her fractured ribs punctured her chest, causing suffocation. Apichai claimed she had approached a high shelf with dumbbells, and one accidentally fell on her chest. However, the autopsy painted a completely different picture. Apichai had beaten the girl with a metal rod, and when that wasn't enough, he used dumbbells. He then bound her hands and feet, shoving her into the box. The next morning, he offered Chalamkhon money to help dispose of the body. Chalamkhon needed the money and agreed. Apichai hoped the truth would never come out, thinking that Kik worked in the dangerous adult entertainment industry where people disappear daily. But now he would face punishment, not only for the murder. The police searched his house for illegal substances and confiscated over 1,000 pills. He could have faced the death penalty for manufacturing them. However, since the police could only prove he was storing them at home, he was unlikely to receive the death penalty. However, the horror didn't end there. After Chalamkhon's testimony, the police feared there might be more victims buried underground. They conducted a thorough search of Apichai's property, especially focusing on the 3 ponds. As a result, on January 16, 2020, investigators made a shocking discovery that stunned all of Thailand and turned Apichai's mansion into a real house of horrors. In the pond next to the house, they found human bones, women's clothing, as well as chains, dumbbells, and cinder blocks, which had helped the bodies sink to the bottom of their watery graves. The pond was also home to a predatory alligator fish. The divers hadn't noticed it, but it had undoubtedly helped the bodies disappear faster than they would have naturally. Considering that it was difficult to search for bones in the murky water, the investigators discussed draining the ponds. However, underground sources prevented them from pumping the water out. They had to rely on the expertise of the divers. To everyone's horror, in the following days, the divers discovered even darker secrets hidden beneath the surface. They raised from the bottom of the pond a set of iron gates weighing 70 kilograms, which fit perfectly into the entrance to Apichai's property. A large knife and around 300 fragments of human bones. The bones belonged to at least 3 women. Among them was a girl about 17 or 18 years old, as well as a very young girl, about 12 years old. Locals quickly reported that in 2011, a neighboring 12-year-old girl had gone missing. She used to play on the grounds of Apichai's property. She could have been one of his victims, but of course the man wasn't going to make things easier for the police by confirming this. In addition to everything mentioned above, on January 23rd, detectives pulled out another metal box from the water. It was sealed and weighted down with dumbbells and chains. Inside, they found another female body. This was the remains of an 18-year-old girl who had gone missing in 2011 or 2012. Interestingly, the box that Apichai had used this time had been a prop in a film made by his grandfather. However, unlike his grandfather, who had brought fame to the Ongvizit family, the grandson had tarnished it. The findings at the House of Horrors became the main news in the city. All of Bangkok was shaken, and the press dubbed Apichai with the same nickname given to a serial killer monk 100 years ago. On January 29, 2020, Apichai confessed to the murder of a foreign worker who had been helping him around the house. He buried the victim's body under a mango tree. The killer explained that they had argued, and Apichai shot the man in the leg. The victim threatened to go to the police, so Apichai, without much hesitation, shot him in the head with a shotgun. Apichai admitted to killing the worker and the girl found in his grandfather's iron box before he murdered Kukik. Thus, investigators were able to confirm the identities of 4 victims: 22-year-old Kukik, the 18-year-old girl, the foreign worker, and a 12-year-old girl. It's curious that at one point Apichai had the thought of hiding the bodies. He promised his friend Chalamchon 5,000 baht or $150 for retrieving them from the pond. Chalamchon agreed, found a skull at the bottom, and brought it to his friend. Chalamchon was hoping for the reward, but instead of money, he received a shot in the ear from Apichai at close range. He wasn't killed, and for that, he was thankful. They never brought up the subject again. After Apichai's arrest, other victims who were lucky enough to survive were no longer afraid to speak out against him. They recalled his volatile nature and extreme cruelty, even towards his girlfriends. And if some poor soul happened to catch his eye while he was under the influence of illegal substances, self-made pills, her fate could have been far worse. For example, one victim told investigators about what happened to her in late December 2019. Apichai kidnapped her and locked her inside the notorious metal box. He released her multiple times, but only to abuse her. She might not have survived if it weren't for one incident. Apichai received a call from a female acquaintance about money. The man became furious and got distracted. The victim took advantage of the situation and managed to escape the house. She contacted a friend and fled. Apichai wasn't above bribing or intimidating his victims to prevent them from going to the police, which is why his crimes went unpunished for so long. The girls didn't believe the police would help them or take action against the wealthy heir of a prestigious family, even if he was known for his vile character. During the trial for the murder of Kiki, Apichai changed his version of events several times. Sometimes he claimed Kiki died from asphyxiation, other times from an overdose of illegal substances. At one point, he said a dumbbell accidentally fell on her chest, but none of the man's contrived explanations convinced anyone. During the trial, witnesses were no longer afraid to testify against him, and his remaining relatives refused to speak in his defense. Given the overwhelming evidence against him, the fact that no one defended him, and the possibility of the death penalty, he finally confessed to the murder of Kiki. He was also found guilty on other charges, including possession of illegal substances and weapons and assault on another woman. The police discovered that at different times several friends, girlfriends, and even acquaintances of Apichai, who were night workers, had disappeared. However, even the most advanced technology couldn't determine exactly how many people he may have killed, though it was clear that he was a serial killer. But it was tragic for the families who still didn't know the fate of their loved ones. Except for Kiki's family. They demanded compensation and received 2.9 million baht, about $80,000. After the truth about Apichai's crimes came to light, as often happens, numerous rumors about his house of horrors emerged. Neighbors recalled seeing black circles on the pond, and while they hadn't thought much of it before, now they believed these were the spirits of the dead. Perhaps they even appeared to Apichai himself, as in late 2019, he was seen carrying food and traditional offerings to the spot where Kiki had been buried. What was once a beautiful mansion in the middle of a wonderful green garden, surrounded by ponds, once a decoration of Bangkok, now it is a place that evokes sheer terror. Only Apichai's aunt, who raised him, occasionally comes to bring offerings to the tombs to honor the deceased ancestors. No one else from the local community dares to approach the House of Horrors. Could anyone blame them? And who would dare? On December 31st, 1999, in Del Rio, Texas, 10-year-old Crystal Surlees was spending the night at her friend 13-year-old Kayleen Harris's house. Suddenly, Crystal woke up to the sound of a scream. Lying on the top bunk, she saw a stranger standing in the room. The man was large, with a mop of unkempt hair and piercing dark eyes. In his hand, he held a knife. Frozen in fear, Crystal watched as the man stabbed her friend multiple times before slashing her throat. Crystal clutched her own neck and tried to stay perfectly still. The intruder seemed so focused on what he was doing that he didn't notice her. Then he moved toward the bedroom door. Placing one hand on the doorknob and the other on the light switch, he paused and turned back, scanning the room. Crystal held her breath, but the man noticed the glint in her wide-open eyes, fixed unblinkingly on him. He took his hand off the doorknob and stepped back into the room toward Crystal. Moments later, he calmly left the room, leaving his two victims bleeding out. If Tommy Lin Sell's entire life could be summed up in one word, it would be instability. From the earliest moments of his childhood, he learned that nothing was permanent. Not family, not friendships, and certainly not a stable home. At just 18 months old, Tommy faced a devastating blow. His twin sister contracted spinal meningitis. It's possible that Tommy was also infected, and the illness may have been a contributing factor to his future behavior. While he was too young for a definitive diagnosis, it's known that this disease can cause severe brain damage. Tommy's sister died from the infection, but he survived. Shortly afterward, his mother sent him to live with his aunt. Tommy lived happily with his aunt until he was 5 years old, and she even wanted to become his legal guardian. However, when his mother learned of this, she took him back. From that moment, Tommy's life began a steep decline. In his mother's small home, there was little space for books and even less for a child's toys. Tommy stopped attending school and began wandering aimlessly through the streets. During one of these wanderings, 8-year-old Tommy met Frank Jones, a predator who preyed on the boy's trust. Frank lured Tommy with gifts, which came at a horrifying cost. Tommy's mother knew he was spending time with an older man, but either couldn't or wouldn't protect her son. Eventually, Tommy stopped going to school altogether. His behavior became so unruly that even his own mother feared him. One morning when Tommy returned from Frank's house, he discovered that his family had packed up their belongings and left without him. At such a young age, too young even to get a job or a driver's license, Tommy was completely alone. Gathering what few possessions he had, including a gun of unknown origin, he left town, hitchhiking from place to place. Unknowingly, he was embarking on a life filled with alcohol, violence, and murder. By the time he was 15, he was accustomed to living as a drifter, traveling across the country and fantasizing about exacting revenge on his abuser, Frank, though he did nothing about it. For now, one summer night in 1979, Tommy broke into a small house in Mississippi looking for beer. Once inside the bedroom, he saw a middle-aged couple, John and Caitlin Cade, sleeping peacefully. Tommy had entered the house just to steal something, but the thrill of the theft quickly gave way to rage. Something about John's face reminded him of Frank. The memories stirred a dormant anger within him. He pulled out a gun, shot the sleeping man, and fled. John woke up in pain and shock. He stumbled into the bathroom to wash the blood off his hands, where he collapsed and bled out before the ambulance arrived. In desperation, Caitlin called the police, and searched the house for the intruder, but Tommy had long since disappeared into the night. After this incident, the teenager replayed the crime in his mind over and over. He thought about how easy it was, how fast it happened. His rage and despair turned into pure adrenaline. It would take several more years for Tommy to fully realize that he was as addicted to killing as he was to alcohol and drugs, but the thrill of murder was unlike anything else. Over the next 13 years, he traveled across the country, working as a mechanic or a laborer at amusement parks, spending his free time raping and killing people. If the police caught him, it was only for offenses like drinking or stealing cars. In May 1992, Tommy found himself in Charleston, West Virginia. For 14 years, he had lived without a family or home, never staying in one place for more than a month. Wherever he went, he was a stranger. Unlike his name, however, his heinous deeds were becoming known. Unfortunately, the police hadn't connected his crimes yet, partly because he had no fixed modus operandi. He used whatever weapon was available and targeted men, women, children, and even entire families. Tommy was unlike a typical criminal. He genuinely enjoyed taking lives. Despite his brutality, he had never been arrested for murder. In the early 1990s, Tommy's mental health, which had always been unstable, grew more erratic as he began to worry that one of his victims might fight back. That fear became a reality in 1992 when he met his match, a 20-year-old woman named Fabienne Witherspoon. By 1992, Tommy had devised a new method to lure victims. He stood by the roadside holding a sign that read, "Hungry, will work for food." Many people tossed him spare change, which he spent on drugs or a motel room. But money wasn't what he was after. He was hunting for something very specific, a kind-hearted young woman who was compassionate enough to invite him home for a meal. Fabienne Witherspoon fit that description perfectly. She was too kind to ignore someone in need of help. When she saw the frail, pitiful man, she offered to take him home, promising to pack him some food. Tommy eagerly agreed. When they arrived at her home, Fabienne grabbed 2 large bags and began filling them with groceries. Tommy stood by the door, watching her movements and planning his attack. After she had finished packing the food, she asked Tommy if he or his family needed anything else. He replied that his wife could use some clothes. Too generous to say no, Fabienne went to her bedroom to pick out some shirts for Tommy's fictitious wife. Alone by the front door, Tommy saw his long-awaited opportunity. While Fabienne rummaged through the closet, he slipped into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and crept up behind her. Sensing his breath on her neck, Fabienne slowly turned around and looked at Tommy. He no longer appeared to be the sad, helpless man she had picked up on the roadside. He now stood with her knife pointed directly at her. Tommy ordered Fabienne to undress. She hesitated, but he pressed the blade to her neck, reminding her that she had no choice. After she disrobed, he led her to the bathroom where he sexually assaulted her. During the attack, however, Fabienne managed to suppress her fear and disgust. She focused on one thing: survival. As she discreetly scanned the room, she looked for something she could use as a weapon. Within arm's reach stood a ceramic duck. Fabienne grabbed it and smashed it against Tommy's head. Caught off guard by the blow and the flying shards, Tommy staggered backward. Before he could react, Fabienne began stabbing him with the sharp fragments of the figurine. She snatched the knife from his hand and bolted for the front door, hoping to escape and call for help. But Tommy intercepted her, dragging her back into the bathroom. Fabienne was not an aggressive person, but Tommy left her no choice. With all the strength she could muster, she stabbed him with the knife. She continued striking him wherever she could, yet Tommy seemed almost impervious to her blows. He eventually overpowered her, took the knife, and tied her up using duct tape and shredded bedsheets. While she struggled to free herself, he grabbed a small stool and beat her until she lost consciousness. Before fleeing, Tommy made a shallow cut across her neck, leaving her for dead. Fabienne regained consciousness hours later. Memories of the assault flooded her mind, and she panicked, unsure if her attacker was still in the house. Struggling free from her restraints, she grabbed a phone and ran out of the house, leaving a trail of blood behind her. Once outside, she called the police. Despite Tommy's lies about having a family and children, he had given Fabienne his real name. Officers quickly located the apartment where he was staying with yet another girlfriend. Seriously injured and writhing in pain, Tommy was taken to the hospital. During the struggle, adrenaline had dulled the pain of Fabienne's attacks. But as he recovered, he realized just how close she had come to killing him. She had seemed so kind, so weak, so defenseless, yet she had left him bedridden. Lying in the hospital bed, staring at the IV in his arm, Tommy made himself a promise. He would never again risk his own safety. From that moment on, he vowed to target only those victims who would be completely incapable of fighting back. He would prey only on children. After recovering, Tommy accepted a plea deal. He served 5 years in prison for the assault on Fabienne, but when he was released, he was angrier than ever before. By 1999, his addiction had reached unimaginable proportions. No matter how many crimes he committed, it was never enough. Finally, he arrived in Del Rio, Texas, where he hoped to quench his insatiable thirst for blood. Tommy spent 6 months in the state looking for the perfect victim. He didn't want his next murder to be random like the previous ones. He wanted it to be deliberate, planned, and very brutal. For this, it was important to him that people trusted him, and as he had recently discovered, the best way to achieve this was by attending church. It was there that he met Terry and Crystal Harris and their 13-year-old daughter, Kayleen, whom everyone simply called Katie. Upon seeing the girl, he realized that she was the one he needed. Tommy tried to find out everything he could about the family. He discovered that in December, the Harrises would help their friend Pam Searles move from Kansas, and Pam and her daughter would stay with Terry and Crystal during the move. More importantly, he learned that on December 30th, Terry would travel to Kansas to help Pam pack, which meant that his wife would be home with the children that night. Tommy saw a perfect opportunity to mark the new year. The evening before the attack, he spent his time in a familiar place, the bar. Leaving around 2 a.m., he headed straight for the Harris home. Murder had become second nature to him, to such an extent that even after drinking, he moved calmly and confidently. Tommy approached the house, opened a window, and climbed inside. He moved from room to room until he found Katie sleeping. Tommy slipped onto the bottom bunk of the bunk bed where the girl slept. In his hand, he held a large knife, which he used to cut Katie's clothes. She woke up, but before she could say anything, the man covered her mouth with his other hand. He tried to assault her, but the girl screamed and jumped out of bed. She tried to escape, but Tommy easily grabbed her and stabbed her, letting her body fall to the floor. After delivering a series of blows, he slashed her throat and was about to leave when he saw the girl on the upper bunk staring at him. Without hesitation, he moved toward her. The poor girl clutched her throat in terror. The man ordered her to lower her hands, and when she obeyed, he drew the knife across her neck. Then Tommy ran out of the room, not forgetting to wipe the doorknob to avoid leaving fingerprints. Bleeding profusely, 10-year-old Crystal Searles lay there, thinking about the other members of Katie's family and her own sisters sleeping in the nearby rooms. Had the man attacked them too? Were they still alive? Crystal forced herself to rise. Holding her neck with one hand, she crawled over to Katie, who was lying on the floor. She was making wheezing sounds. Crystal wanted to comfort her friend, to tell her everything would be okay, but realized she couldn't utter a word. Unable to speak, Crystal simply lay beside Katie and stroked her back. Soon, Katie went silent, and Crystal understood that Katie was gone. But at that very moment, she heard a voice telling her, "Don't lie here. Get up. Come on. Go, go." Later, Crystal would admit that it was Katie who had helped her that night, as if her soul was guiding her on what to do. Crystal was undoubtedly afraid to stay in the house. What if the man was still inside? But she understood that she needed to call for help, so she went outside and saw a light in the distance. Katie's family lived in a very remote area, surrounded by nothing but desert. Luckily, another house was nearby, and Crystal hurried toward it. She banged on the doors. The startled homeowner asked who was there, but Crystal couldn't answer. She desperately kept knocking. Thankfully, the residents decided to open the door. They contacted emergency services, and Crystal, still bleeding, wrote notes to explain everything. She wrote 3 lines. "The Harrises are hurt. Please tell them to hurry. I need help for my neck. Will I survive?" Crystal was airlifted to a hospital in San Antonio. Miraculously, doctors were able to save her life and restore her ability to speak. After the surgery, Crystal woke up weak but with a sharp memory of what had happened. The first thing she asked was whether Katie was okay, although she likely already knew the answer. Then she described the attacker to the officers and helped create a composite sketch. Katie's mother recognized the face. It was that of their new acquaintance, Tommy Lynn Sells. When Tommy's picture was shown to Crystal among photos of other men, she confirmed that he was the one who had attacked her and her friend. At 5:30 a.m. on January 2nd, officers stood on the doorstep of Tommy's house. The door was unlocked, so they went inside. The expression on the man's face showed neither surprise nor indignation. He simply said, "I'm glad I finally got caught. I'm tired of doing this." During a search of the area around Tommy's house, the police found a knife approximately 30 centimeters long. This grotesque weapon was clearly Tommy's favorite, as it had been sharpened so often that the blade had become incredibly thin. The man didn't try to deny anything. On the contrary, he willingly talked about the crime and even agreed to a reconstruction of the events. He led the officers through the rooms, pointing out the various bedrooms in the Harris home and describing where everyone had slept that night. He explained that he hadn't touched the other members of the household because he came for Katie specifically. Perhaps the large number of people in the house made him wary of fully carrying out his violent plans, which is why he killed only Katie. During the reconstruction, the officers likely began to realize they were dealing with a dangerous individual. However, they had yet to uncover the full scale of his crimes. In the car, as they were returning to the station, Tommy leaned toward the investigator and whispered, "I think you want to know about the others." Tommy revealed that over 20 years, he had brutally killed more than 70 people. Some of the attacks were so spontaneous and random that he didn't even know the names of his victims. Often his crimes remained unsolved or innocent people were wrongly convicted for them. For instance, he confessed to the infamous 1982 murder of a woman and the attack on her young daughters in St. Louis. In 1982, Melissa DeBoer was 7 years old. She lived with her mother, Joanne Tate, and younger sister, Renee. On that April night, Melissa awoke to an unfamiliar noise. She didn't understand why there was a naked man standing before her or why her mother was lying motionless on the floor. When she asked what was happening, the man said her mother was asleep. He then pulled Melissa out of bed, carried her to her mother's room, laid her on the bed, and began undressing her. However, Melissa fought back desperately and bit him. Enraged, the man pushed her away, and she noticed something glinting in the darkness. It was a knife, which he didn't hesitate to use. Afterward, he went to the kitchen to wash the blood off the knife. Barely alive, Melissa knew she needed to hide and crawled under her sister's bed. From there, she was forced to watch as the man sat in the room, lit a cigarette, and turned on the television until she lost consciousness. Hours later, Melissa, her gravely injured sister, and their deceased mother were found by Melissa's uncle and her mother's boyfriend. Despite their horrific injuries, Melissa and Renee survived, but Joanne was killed. For this crime, Joanne's ex-boyfriend, Rodney Lincoln, was sentenced to life in prison. The conviction relied solely on the testimony of 7-year-old Melissa and a hair that police claimed belonged to Lincoln. In 2010, advanced DNA testing revealed the hair did not belong to Lincoln. In 2015, Melissa saw a photograph of Tommy Lynn Sells, and she was struck by a wave of memories. She realized she had been blaming the wrong man all these years. The true killer was Tommy Lynn Sells. Melissa refused to remain silent. She went to the police and recanted her testimony, leading to Rodney's release in 2018 after 36 years of wrongful imprisonment. Another high-profile case linked to Tommy is that of Julie Rhee and her 10-year-old son, Joel Kirkpatrick. On the night of October 13, 1997, under the cover of darkness, the predator entered their home and stabbed young Joel to death. Awoken by her son's horrific screams, Julie confronted the killer. They struggled, but the stranger escaped. Julie was devastated and overwhelmed with grief, but she wasn't given the chance to mourn in peace. Despite injuries she could not have inflicted on herself, she was accused of Joel's murder. False accusations from her ex-husband, inadequate forensic technology, and a prosecutor blinded by ambition to secure a conviction all led to Julie being sentenced to 65 years in prison. After Tommy Lynn Sells was arrested, he confessed to the crime. Julie was exonerated in 2006, but the prosecutor refused to reopen Joel's case, denying him official justice. The trial of Tommy Lynn Sells began 9 months after the murder of Katie Harris, with 11-year-old Crystal Searles as the prosecution's key witness. While law enforcement was investigating Sells' confessions to other crimes, the immediate focus was to secure a conviction for Katie's murder and the attack on Crystal. If found guilty, Sells faced either life imprisonment or the death penalty. By the time of the trial, Crystal had physically recovered from the deep wound to her neck and was prepared to testify, determined to seek justice for Katie. Crystal made her mother promise not to cry in court, fearing it might make her break down as well. That day, Crystal saw Sells for the first time since the attack. Walking past her attacker with confidence, she ascended the witness stand, but nerves initially got the better of her. After a brief pause to compose herself, she delivered her testimony with remarkable clarity and courage. Pointing directly at Sells, she detailed the horrific events of that night. At one point, to help the jury visualize what had happened, she lay down on a table and demonstrated how Sells had slashed her throat. Her testimony was so powerful that even Sells' defense attorney struggled to maintain composure. When his turn came to cross-examine Crystal, he simply smiled, praised her bravery, and stated that he had no questions for her. The jury deliberated for only an hour and 10 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Sells' guilt was indisputable, and even his attorney focused solely on sparing him from the death penalty. On September 18, 2000, Tommy Lynn Sells was convicted of Katie's murder and the attempted murder of Crystal Searles. After further deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty. Crystal later admitted that, initially, she wanted this outcome, but over time her feelings changed. She struggled with the idea of wishing death upon another person, even someone like Sells. Through his confessions and corroborated evidence, investigators linked Sells to at least 22 murders, with credible connections to another 15 cases across the country. However, due to Texas laws, prisoners sentenced to death cannot be extradited to face trial in other states. On April 3, 2014, Tommy Lynn Sells was executed. When offered the chance to make a final statement, he declined. Despite his silence in his final moments, Tommy Lynn Sells left a legacy of pain and terror. For over 2 decades, he evaded justice, his transient lifestyle enabling him to commit heinous acts and disappear like a phantom. This rootlessness, shaped by his chaotic upbringing, became his greatest weapon. Yet for his victims and their families, Sells remains an unshakable memory, a symbol of unimaginable evil and the devastating toll it exacts.
Toulouse, February 27, 1989. 21-year-old Valerie Tarot was found dead in her home. The scene that unfolded before the eyes of the police was shocking in its cruelty. Valerie lay on the bed, wearing a bathrobe, her wrists bound with a shoelace, a scarf in her mouth as a gag. It was soaked in blood that had flowed from her throat. The room floor was covered with the torn underwear of the girl, ripped in half. One obvious injury on her body was a strangulation mark on her neck. The autopsy provided even more food for thought for the police. 2 scarves were found deep in Valerie's throat, and the results of the toxicological examination showed that she had been under the influence of some substances. There were so many of them that they alone could have caused her death. Furthermore, a few days earlier, a building worker in which the girl lived found Valerie's backpack in the trash. Inside were her documents, an ashtray, cigarette butts, a glass, shoes, keys to the apartment, and a blood-stained bedside lamp. Gathering all this information, the investigators concluded that the girl had voluntarily left this life. The case was closed. Of course, such a conclusion did not satisfy Valerie's relatives, who tried unsuccessfully to persuade the police to investigate the case as a murder. 11 months later, hikers on the trail to Fenouil found a wallet and documents belonging to a girl named Laure Martin. On the same day, in a canal approximately 20 kilometers away in Bonrepos-Roquette, they discovered the lifeless body of a 19-year-old girl. She was completely naked, except for her socks. It was indeed Laure, who had been missing for 2 days. The autopsy revealed that the girl died from strangulation. However, prior to her death, she had been sexually assaulted anally and vaginally with an object, apparently a baseball bat. Additionally, the forensic expert found a torn spleen, indicating a very strong blow to the abdomen, such as a kick. The police began an investigation, but the investigators did not come across any significant leads, and of course, it never occurred to anyone to establish a connection between the 2 cases. 7 years passed, and it was the morning of February 11, 1997. At 9 o'clock in the morning, firefighters entered an apartment in a multi-story building located on the 4th floor in Toulouse. Inside, they discovered the lifeless and charred body of a 29-year-old woman named Martin Matthias. Martin was lying face down on the bed. On the floor, there was a magazine from an automatic pistol, and in the bathroom, there was a blood-stained and torn bra. The bathtub and the carpet was stained with blood, and there was also a light bulb on the floor, which had been unscrewed. The firefighters concluded that there were 2 points of fire, 2 clear attempts of deliberate arson in the bedroom, and in the living room near the armchair. The police inspector in charge of the investigation combined all these pieces of evidence and concluded that Martin's death occurred as a result of a decision made by Martin herself. 10 days later, on February 22, 1997, 21-year-old Emily Isps entered a bar in Toulouse. It was the afternoon, and she wanted to have a drink with her friends. In the bar, she met a pleasant and attractive guy named Patrice. Patrice had his own way of attracting girls because he distributed prohibited substances to Emily and her friends. Patrice and Emily spent the remaining part of the day and the following morning together. In the evening, the young man planned to go to a concert and invited Emily to join him. She accepted his invitation. However, before the concert, they met up with Patrice's friend, Eve, with whom he had been living for some time. The group of young people had dinner together and had some drinks. Then Patrice and Emily got into Patrice's car and headed to the concert, which they arrived at around 1:30 a.m. Emily danced a lot, while Patrice spent more time at the bar drinking beer. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Emily, feeling tired as she hadn't slept for 2 days, asked her new acquaintance to drive her home. The exhausted girl hadn't even had a chance to sit in the car when she immediately fell asleep. When she woke up, it seemed to her that only a moment had passed, but she was already lying on the back seat of the car. Opening her eyes, Emily was astonished to see Patrice above her with bulging eyes, choking her. He no longer resembled the pleasant guy she had spent the whole day with. Emily couldn't understand how someone could spend an entire day with such a nice guy and then, within a minute, he turned into a monster who was now strangling her. Emily tried to resist. She screamed, scratched Patrice, and tried to tear his hair. He ordered her to shut up and struck her face several times, after which Emily lost consciousness. A few minutes later, she woke up without her panties. He must have tried to violate her. Emily thought that she probably wouldn't survive and decided to pretend to be dead or talk to him. She chose to talk to Patrice, trying to remain calm and relieve tension. She repeated that she understood everything, that such things happen when someone drinks too much, that everything was fine, and she wouldn't tell anyone anything. Patrice stopped the car and asked her to please him. Emily refused. Then he moved to the back seat with her, continued undressing her, and violated her again. Emily did her best to stay calm. She continued talking to him, minimizing the harm he had caused her. Suddenly, Patrice burst into tears and said he regretted what he had done. He said to Emily, "You hold 10 years of my life in your hands." Emily didn't think he was such a great actor, so he must have been sincere. Hope arose within her again. Emily calms down her assailant and tormentor. She speaks to him softly because her only thought is to get out of this nightmare alive. She managed to calm Patrice down, and she asked him to drive her home. He refused. So they went to Eve, a friend where Patrice was staying. They lay down to sleep together in one bed, but Patrice didn't touch Emily anymore. Expectation set in. Emily went through hell, but she's alive. She knew that Eve was in the neighboring room, so she felt slightly safer, despite the fact that the attacker was sleeping just a few centimeters away from her. The girl managed to doze off for a few hours until she heard Eve and his girlfriend wake up. Emily got up and found them in the kitchen. Eve and Nora, his girlfriend, were horrified when they saw bruises on Emily's face. She explained to them that she was attacked by a guy at the concert. She didn't see his face because it was covered by a hood. Emily lied, protecting Patrice, but mainly to protect herself. After all, she was still in a state of shock and deeply shaken. Perhaps she wasn't fully aware of what was happening, as if her soul had detached from her body. This is a common defense mechanism for people who have experienced trauma. Eve quietly took her aside and asked if Patrice had anything to do with it, because even though Patrice was staying with him, Eve knew that his ex-girlfriend had kicked him out after a major argument, and Eve didn't fully trust him. Nora insists that Patrice had nothing to do with it, that it was a guy from the concert. Patrice woke up and also went to the kitchen. He confirmed Emily's story. Yes, it was a guy in a hood. Unfortunately, there was no chance of catching him. In any case, Nora drove Emily to the hospital. Doctors found signs of strangulation on the girl's neck. Additionally, she had several injuries on her face. She would have to spend a few days in the hospital under medical observation. In the hospital, Emily finally felt safer. She decided to tell the truth about what really happened, that Patrice attacked her. However, he suspected that Emily might confess everything, so he had already disappeared. Now, after one of Patrice's victims survived, the police finally start searching for him. He will be on the run for 3 months. On June 14, 1997, at a rural festival, Patrice, who now calls himself Frank, met Mireille Norman. Mireille, 35 years old, lived in a chalet in a small town below Foire. Mireille felt sorry for the young man who complained about having nowhere to stay and offered him to live with her in exchange for doing some housework. Besides, on the 20th, Mireille planned to visit her parents and decided that Frank would take care of the house. That's how Mireille and Frank lived together for several days. During the day, he worked in the garden, fixed things, and in the evening, they had dinner together, talked, and smoked. On June 19th, Mireille and Frank had a great time. Mireille got a new job at a wolf sanctuary in Orlu, so she arranged a celebratory dinner. They drank a lot and smoked cannabis. Obviously, both of them were in an uplifted mood, and Frank, that is, Patrice, tried to kiss Mireille. But she clearly wasn't ready for it and went into the bedroom, trying to avoid an unpleasant situation. However, the man followed her into the room, grabbed her by the head, and hit her against the wall. Mireille felt dizzy, but she managed to break free from his grasp. Then Patrice picked up a chair and hit his victim, who had fallen unconscious on the bed. He brutally assaulted her several times. When this brought her back to consciousness, he started choking her with his bare hands, but when he released her throat, Mireille was still breathing. Then Patrice tied her ankles and wrists and gagged her. After doing all this, he took Mireille's body to the first floor and began cleaning up to remove all traces of blood. He painted the blue carpet with blue paint to conceal the blood stains. He used an angle grinder to remove the top layer of wooden furniture that had blood stains on it. The killer burned Mireille's sheets and clothes in the garden and washed his own in the washing machine. Then he wrapped the victim's body in a blanket, dug a hole in the garden, and buried Mireille in her own garden the following evening. Before leaving the chalet, he stole 5,000 francs in cash and some valuable items that could be sold, including the angle grinder. And in an attempt to divert suspicion from himself, he left a note on the table: "Mireille, I don't know where you are, I finished my work and I'm leaving." On June 20, 1997, Patrice was driving Mireille's car and heading to Spain. It was also his 29th birthday. A few days later, Patrice was already in Alicante, in the south of Spain. There he met 2 French girls, Isabelle and Valerie. The young people quickly became friends and spent several days together, sunbathing on the beach, having meals together, and going for walks. Then the girls' vacation ended, and it was time for them to return to Paris. They promised to meet again someday and exchanged phone numbers. If only they knew. Patrice continued his journey, visiting Germany and Belgium, before arriving in Paris on September 1, 1997. Of course, he called Isabelle and Valerie, and that same evening they agreed to have dinner together at a restaurant. The girls were happy to see their new friend again, but Patrice explained his situation to them. His car and all his money had been stolen. He was quite skilled at portraying himself as a victim. He asked the girls if one of them could let him stay with them for 2 days before his departure. Valerie couldn't accommodate him, as she was leaving for a business trip the next day, but Isabelle allowed him to spend the night on her sofa, with the condition that it wouldn't exceed 4 days. On September 4, 1997, the residents of the same apartment building where 31-year-old Isabelle Chicheri lived woke up to a loud explosion. It turned out that the explosion followed a fire that had started in the girl's apartment. Her partially burned body was found lying on the bed. The gas burners in the kitchen were turned on, and the fire broke out near the bathroom. It was evident that Isabelle's death was not accidental. The front door was not forced open, and there were 3 glasses, a bottle of pink wine, and champagne on the table. The wounds on the victim's body indicated the incredible cruelty of the killer. There was blood in the toilet, and blood was flowing from her mouth, nose, and anus. However, no trace of semen was found on Isabel's body. Instead, a blood-stained carrot was found near the mattress. The autopsy would confirm that the perpetrator tortured the girl with it. Moreover, she had been severely beaten. The blows were inflicted all over her body, but mainly on her face. Asphyxiation was the cause of death. When investigators learned that Isabel had sheltered a man named Patrice, they immediately paid attention to this detail because the police had been searching for a certain Patrice for some time. And it was all thanks to the testimony of Emily Espy, who managed to survive Patrice Allegre's attack at the end of February. Then, after the disappearance of Mireille Norman, her relatives, who were expecting her as a guest, became worried. However, it took 3 weeks before her body was found tied up and buried in the garden. But after the discovery of the body, the gendarmes' suspicions were closely linked to Patrice. Because although he presented himself under a false name, many witnesses had seen his face and recognized him from the pictures presented by the investigators. When he returned to Paris in early September, he was already actively being sought. The search warrant for him circulated throughout France. The police contacted his relatives and friends and promised a reward for assistance in his capture. And then Patrice contacted a friend and asked if he could stay overnight in Paris. That's when the investigators saw an opportunity to apprehend him. They asked this man to call Patrice back and direct him to an ideal location for capture in Châtenay-Malabry. On September 5, 1997, at 5:10 p.m., Patrice entered the house where the police were already hiding. He didn't resist arrest. According to some witnesses, he even seemed relieved to be arrested, as if he were tired of hiding. Surprisingly, the arrest of the serial killer did not attract much attention from the public. Perhaps it was because the media did not report that a serial killer was on the run, as the investigators initially could not establish a connection between the different cases. But it was also because another tragedy dominated the headlines: the car accident, and the death of Princess Diana in Paris on August 31, 1997. As a result, Patrice's arrest did not receive much attention. It didn't make big headlines. When he was interrogated, Patrice willingly cooperated. He confessed to his crimes and described them in detail. It was horrifying because he described them in the present tense, as if reliving them, but with a completely detached expression. Patrice was arrested for the attack on Emily Espy and the murders of Mireille Norman and Isabelle Chicheri. However, when Patrice talked about Mireille Norman, the girl who allowed him to stay in her chalet in exchange for work in the garden, he referred to her by a different name. He called her Martin, which made the investigators wonder. Gradually, they began to realize that he was confusing her with another one of his victims. Knowing Patrice's affinity for elements of luxury life, investigators offer him champagne, oysters, foie gras, and more outdoor walks in exchange for him revealing information about his other victims. And indeed, after this, Patrice confessed to killing 3 more women: Martin Mathias, Laure Martine, and Valérie Thériault. Only after the puzzle pieces started coming together as evidence, already known to the detectives. As it is already known, in the cases of Martin Mathias and Valérie Thériault, investigators concluded that they had taken their own lives. However, it turned out that Patrice personally knew all the women. Valérie Thériault was his colleague. They both worked as waiters at the same café in Toulouse. Laure Martine lived with him in the same region of Toulouse, so she got into his car because she recognized him. As for Martin Mathias, she was Patrice's neighbor. They lived in apartments opposite each other. In other words, from the very beginning, many clues pointed to Patrice Allegre as a possible suspect, but investigators did not notice them for a long time. It was unusual for a serial killer. Patrice knew all his victims personally, even if sometimes only for a couple of days, as in the case of Emily, but he always followed the same script: we spend time together, go out, become friends, and then an attack follows. Although Patrice assisted the investigation during interrogations and quickly confessed to the killings, investigators and later psychiatrists noticed that when it came to discussing the murders, he found it much more difficult to provide explanations. Each time, his version of events sounded like this: he tried to kiss the victim, she refused, he became enraged and strangled her. In some cases he used objects to assault the victims, but the man himself insisted that he did everything alone. This indicates that his version of the murders and attacks does not correspond to reality. Is it a lie, or does he remember the events poorly? It's hard to say, but in any case, it casts doubt on his confession. For example, let's consider the case of Martin Mathias. Patrice recalls how he met her at McDonald's in early February 1997. He asked if he could sit at her table, and they started talking, finding a common topic in boxing. Martin Mathias was the boxing champion of France, and Patrice had practiced it in the past. According to Patrice, Martin agreed to meet him again and invited him to have a drink at her place a few days later, and it was during this meeting that everything went wrong. However, the autopsy doesn't fully support this version. Toxicological analysis revealed alcohol and chloroform in her system, even though she didn't drink, and there was a mark of an electric shock in the intimate area of her body. As you may recall, a light bulb was unscrewed in the apartment, and something was done to the electrical wiring. This leads to the speculation that the girl did not invite Patrice to her place, but he stalked her because he lived across the street. Then he incapacitated her because under normal circumstances, Martin Mathias was stronger than him. Of course, there are no facts that definitively confirm this, but it is important to note that there are discrepancies between the story told by the killer and the evidence. And this implies that he is not striving to be completely honest with the investigation. Moreover, he spoke eagerly and extensively about his childhood. Patrice was born on June 20 in Toulouse. His mother, Michelle, was a hairdresser and became pregnant with a boy at the age of 17. His father, Roland, was 4 years older than her and worked as a police officer. Patrice always knew that he was an unwanted child. 7 years later, Michelle and Roland had their second son, a desired child. Patrice's childhood could not be called happy. His parents often argued, and his father would physically abuse his mother. Patrice tried to intervene, but he only ended up getting beaten himself. Roland, being a police officer, was often absent from home, paying little attention to his son. Patrice's mother, on the other hand, showed little affection towards him. However, she was an alcoholic, and when Patrice was young, she fell into an alcoholic coma right in front of him in her beauty salon. She was also unfaithful to her husband and constantly cheated on him. Patrice became a witness to some of her intimate encounters as well as the reconciliations between Michelle and Roland after fights. Often, when he tried to sleep in his room, he would hear his mother's moans from the adjacent room and would cover his head with a pillow, trying to drown out those sounds. Another time, she derived pleasure from one of her friends in the car while 6-year-old Patrice sat in the back seat and saw everything. Despite all this, Patrice despised his father and idealized his mother. He would defend her and couldn't stand it when people spoke ill of her. He had difficulty studying in school, and he had to repeat a year several times. He would skip classes, and his mother allowed him to do so. During this time, he began committing crimes, stealing and selling drugs. However, every time he was arrested, his father would come to his rescue. For example, Roland once paid 30,000 francs as compensation to the victims of Patrice's thefts. The roots of his behavior possibly trace back to a traumatic event that occurred when he was 13 years old. He ran away from home, and 2 boys abducted him. They drugged the boy with heavy illicit substances and subjected him to abuse in a car, after which they discarded him on the side of a remote road. This couldn't have left scars on a boy who was not yet 14 years old. This certainly doesn't justify what he did afterwards, but it provides an opportunity to better understand him. It was from the age of 14 that he started drinking heavily and using illicit substances. The problem was that Patrick, who was described as charming when sober, completely changed under the influence of some substances. He became truly aggressive to the point where his friends who knew about it were afraid of him. Once, When he was drunk at a bar, someone said something bad about his younger brother, and Patrick flew into a rage. He left, but then returned to the bar with a weapon, which he held to the person's head and pulled the trigger. By some miracle, the gun didn't fire, and Patrick was apprehended. It could have been his first and last murder. Patrice Allegre committed his first attack on a girl when he was only 17 years old. He met the girl at a party, and initially, everything was going fine. They went to a park where Patrice tried to make advances towards the girl, but she pushed him away. As you can already understand by this point, rejections drove him into a rage. The guy started choking the girl but quickly stopped, apologized, and took her home. However, his modus operandi was already beginning to emerge. Interestingly, Patrice never had problems with girls, but the problem was that there were these two sides. As long as the girl agreed, he was charming, but if she rejected him, he obtained what he desired by force. As for long-lasting romantic relationships, Patrice had two of them in his life. The first one was with a woman named Cecile. They met in 1986 when Patrice was 18, and it was their first true love story. The young couple dated for 7 years, and they had a daughter together. However, in 1989, a few months after committing his first murder, their relationship ended. Their relationship resembled the relationship of Patrice's parents. They would argue a lot, and Patrice would physically attack Cecile. But with Cecile, Patrice could somewhat restrain himself. For example, when he attempted to strangle her, he stopped with the words, "No, not you, not you." In 1994, Cecile ended up in the hospital with a broken jaw. She filed a complaint against Patrice, who was arrested for several weeks. In 1995, Cecile finally decided to break up with Patrice. The following year, he met Sylvie, with whom he would live until February 1997 when Sylvie also left Patrice due to his aggression. It was precisely then that Patrice moved into his friend Eve's house and attacked Emily Isps. The trial of Patrice began on February 11, 2002, in Toulouse. He was accused of 6 acts of violence, 5 murders, and 1 attempted murder. During the trial, questions arose about numerous mistakes made by the police during the investigation of Valérie Thariot and Martin Matthias, who concluded it was a suicide. There were even rumors that the police were protecting Patrice, considering his father was one of them. However, this was just a conspiracy theory. Patrice's case was subject to analysis by psychiatrists, which was rare for criminal cases in France. One of the most interesting aspects was his contrasting attitudes towards his mother and father. He idealized his mother but demonized his father. At the age of 13, he even suggested to his mother that they should kill his father. Despite this, Roland Allegre, Patrice's father, appeared in court, took the witness stand, and looked his son in the eyes, saying that despite everything he had done, he still loved him. Patrice's response was, "Well, I don't love you, I hate you, I should have killed you, as I told Mom, then I wouldn't have caused so much harm." He drew a parallel between his crimes and his father. However, he always refused to blame his mother for anything. Psychiatrists believe that a significant influence on him was the trauma caused by his mother's intimate explosions. Once terrorized by his mother's moans as a child, he transformed into a strong man who terrorized women, suppressing their moans, the very soul of these women. Interestingly, he always attacked his victims when they were unconscious, and the first victim who managed to calm him down, convince him not to kill her, was Emily, who was lucky enough to wake up and speak to him. Such a feeling as if he could render girls unconscious, he could do whatever he wanted with them, but when Emily woke up, she regained her human face. He himself said, "I have a memory lapse. I remember choking her. Then she came to, and I apologized. It brought me to my senses. I'm ashamed of what I did. I don't know what to say." It is also interesting why girls suddenly refused him, even though it seemed obvious that there was an attraction between the young people. The psychologist thinks that he himself provoked the women's rejection, subconsciously, Of course, he wanted to have power over the victims because it is common among killers who have themselves experienced violence in childhood. He wanted to transform from a passive victim into an active killer who could fully control the situation. It was their abnormal way of regaining control over the situation. As for the motive, it would seem easy to answer this question since he violated all his victims. However, it's not that simple. Although this explanation seems most obvious, he himself confirmed that he did not derive pleasure during the attacks. According to a psychiatrist who examined him, for someone who sometimes has normal relationships and at other times commits terrible murders, he is not simply a sexual maniac. Having control over the situation was of much greater significance. In essence, it was violence that turned into humiliation rather than humiliation turning into violence. He himself could never answer why he killed. He hoped that psychiatrists would provide him with an answer to this question, which is why he eagerly spoke with them. At the trial, another important question arose. Did Patrice have other victims, especially during the break between 1990 and 1997? Since some of his known victims did not receive proper investigation, it is quite possible. Patrice himself claims that he did not kill anyone else, but can he be trusted? Initially, he only confessed to 2 murders and 1 act of violence. The police formed a team of specialists to determine if he could be responsible for other unsolved crimes. Another promise of a walk, as well as champagne and oysters, allowed them to elicit a hint from Patrice about the unsolved case of Lynn Gabaldi's murder. They examined 191 unsolved cases since 1984, and they managed to find 2 witnesses who were former prostitutes involved in Lynn Gabaldi's case. Florencia Chigliafi, who appeared in the press under the pseudonym Fanny, and Christelle Berg, known to the public as Patricia. Together, they accused Patrice of Lynn's death. However, in addition to him, they implicated the prosecutor of Toulouse, Marc Bourrage, in criminal activities. Allegedly, he organized sadomasochistic parties where politicians and judges would enjoy themselves. Fanny claimed that the girls did not attend the parties willingly. They were subjected to abuse, torture, and sometimes killed. And Lynn Gabaldi provided the prostitutes for the orgies. She threatened to expose everything to the police, so on the orders of Marc Bourrage, Patrice killed her. Dominique Baudis's name was mentioned once. He was the former mayor of Toulouse. Supposedly, he was present during Lynn's murder along with Bourrage. Seeing the growing tension surrounding his case, Patrice wrote a letter to a well-known show, stating that Baudis and Bourrage were indeed part of a criminal network. 2 weeks later, the same show aired an interview with Fanny, who talked about the children she saw chained in a torture room on the ground floor of a house near Toulouse. However, just 15 days after confessing to Lynn Gabaldi's murder, Patrice retracted his statement. It was later revealed that the show's producers had generously paid Patrice and Fanny for their stories. It also emerged that Dominique Baudis couldn't have been present at Lynn's murder because he was in Paris. And Marc Bourrage didn't even know Patrice. The accusations against the politicians were dropped, and Patrice and Fanny were charged with providing false testimony. In July 2005, Fanny and Patrice were sentenced to 18 months and 3 years in prison, respectively, for giving false testimony. On February 21, 2002, Patrice Allegre was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 22 years. He is now 54 years old and has already served the mandatory 22 years. During this time, he entered into a relationship with a psychologist from Canada who moved to France and settled closer to her beloved in prison. Surely, Patrice wants to see the woman and his daughter outside of prison. He applied for early release but abandoned the idea due to the conclusions of psychiatrists who believe that despite all his efforts, he has not been rehabilitated, and the risk of relapse is extremely high. Emily Isps, the only surviving victim of Patrice's attack, who testified against her assailant in court, passed away in 2006, 9 years after the incident. Unfortunately, she made this decision on her own.
Los Angeles, California. Every day of every year, young people from all over the country come here, hoping to make their dreams come true. Some want to become movie stars. Others dream of singing on stage or working in the fashion industry. But not everyone shares these hopes and dreams. Among the stars, the glitz, and the glamour, there are those who come to Hollywood to escape their past, an unworthy past. In a city where strangers never attract attention, they can easily blend into the crowd. In 2001, the dreams of one girl would be cut short after a night of bloody crime. Her connection with a famous Hollywood actor would turn her death into a sensation. But this story holds much more. Decades of cat-and-mouse games between the police and a calculating killer. A man whose knife pierced not one, but 4 young women. A serial killer who would become known as the Hollywood Ripper or the Boy Next Door. It happened almost 30 years ago in Glenview, Illinois. But even today, the Piccaccio family is haunted by memories of the day they learned that Tricia had been brutally murdered. 18-year-old Tricia Piccaccio had just graduated from high school. On an unusually cool and foggy Friday evening, August 13, 1993, Tricia and her school friends gathered to play a scavenger hunt. Then they all had dinner at a restaurant. Essentially, it was their last meeting before the young people started their university education. After a pleasant evening, the girl returned home a little after 1 in the morning. Holding her keys in her hand, she approached the door, intending to open it, but she never managed to do so. The next morning, her father woke up as usual, brewed himself a cup of coffee, and went outside to his van. The cup fell from his hand when his eyes were confronted with a scene too horrific to describe in words. He fell to his knees before his daughter and screamed. His scream echoed down the cul-de-sac, alarming all the neighbors. Despite the apparent futility of his efforts, Tricia's father tried to provide first aid to bring her back to life. When Tricia's mother learned what had happened, she fainted. Later, both parents were taken to the hospital in a state of shock. The police immediately began an investigation. Tricia had obviously been attacked, her arm twisted so severely that it broke, and she had received multiple stab wounds. But who could have wished such a death upon an 18-year-old girl loved by many? The investigators did their utmost, but a year after the murder, they had made no progress. However, about 12 months after Tricia's death, a neighbor's boy began attracting attention with his strange behavior. 17-year-old Michael Gargiulo was the best friend of Tricia's brother, Doug Piccaccio. Right after the incident, his reaction was quite natural. The boy was in shock over the murder of the neighbor girl he personally knew. He practically grew up in the Piccaccio house, often having dinner with the family. And just 2 days before her murder, Michael and another friend, Olson, had given Tricia a ride to her boyfriend's house. Overall, Michael was just a quiet guy to the Piccaccio family, a friend of their son who had never shown any oddities. But a year after Tricia's murder, the teenager started giving gifts to the family. It started with flowers he brought to Tricia's mother. Then he gave her and her husband a gift certificate for a restaurant dinner, and later he bought Tricia's father a shirt. This was enough for detectives Jack Reed and Mark Baldwin from Cook County, Illinois, to take a closer look at the boy. A psychologist suggested that with these gifts, he was trying to atone for some sin. The detectives learned that Gargiulo had previously been involved in theft. Then Tricia's brother told the police about an interesting conversation he had with Michael. Michael once asked him if he knew who attacked Tricia. Would he be able to kill him? Doug said that the answer was known to any father or brother of a murdered girl. After this conversation, a detective called Doug and said that according to Michael, Doug had threatened him. It seemed that Michael at least knew more than he was saying, and when he was invited for a conversation at the station, he admitted that the morning after the murder, their mutual friend Eric Agazim had come to him and asked for help hiding something in his gym bag. Michael insisted he didn't know what was in the bag, but suspected it was the murder weapon, a knife. The detectives believed Michael, and when Agazim refused to talk to the police, he immediately became their main suspect. However, the investigators could not find any evidence against Eric, and the investigation stalled. For several years, there were no developments in the case. But one day, 5 years after Tricia's murder, Michael Gargiulo appeared on the Piccaccio family's doorstep. Clearly, he was still tormented by what he knew about the case, and he asked Tricia's mother if he could speak with her husband. The man wasn't home, so she let the boy wait for him. When Tricia's father entered the house, he immediately understood from Michael's face that they were in for a serious conversation. But before they could exchange even a few words, the door opened, and Michael's father and one of his sisters came in. Without providing any explanation, they just took the boy away with them. Trisha's father immediately contacted the police and said they should talk to Michael again, but they were too late. Michael Gargiulo had left Glenview. Hollywood, 2001. 8 years and thousands of miles from the murder of Trisha Pacaccio. The bright lights of Hollywood have always attracted the young and beautiful. 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was no exception. For a girl from a small town in Northern California, life in Los Angeles was full of opportunities, new acquaintances, and entertainment. Ashley studied at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. Naturally, she dreamed of working in the fashion industry. In the meantime, she loved having fun with her close-knit group of friends who always spent time together. One evening, the beautiful and smiling girl caught the eye of a rising Hollywood star, 23-year-old Ashton Kutcher. The young people had crossed paths at parties thrown by mutual friends, so when Ashton invited Ashley out to dinner, no one was surprised. They spoke on the phone and agreed that he would pick her up and they would go to a restaurant together. Ashton arrived at about 10:45 p.m. The lights were on in all the rooms, and the young man confidently knocked on the door, but the girl did not open it. He knocked again, but again there was no response. Ashton thought he was too late. Ashley got upset and left with friends. However, before leaving, he peeked through the window by the door. The apartment was a bit messy, but Ashley had just moved in, and that was quite natural. He also saw red wine spilled on the carpet. Not giving it much thought, Ashton went home. As we know now, it was not wine at all. The body of 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was discovered by her neighbor early Thursday morning. The girl entered the house and almost immediately saw her friend lying on the floor, blue and covered in blood. Fearing that the killer might still be in the house, she ran outside and called emergency services. But she was in vain to hurry. The killer had long since disappeared, and it was too late to help Ashley. Detectives who arrived at the crime scene, Tom Small, were confronted with a gruesome sight. Even after so many years, they clearly remember seeing an enormous amount of blood, with Ashley lying a little further away. They marveled at the rage the killer must have been in to stab her 47 times. But what astonished the detectives even more was what they didn't see, any clues that would tell them which direction to move. Ashley's friends provided the detectives with one and only one hint in this case, telling them about a young man who had lived next door to Ashley a few months ago. He introduced himself to her as Michael, a heating and air conditioning repairman. When Ashley's friend's heater broke, they invited Michael over. When he appeared at their house, the young man mentioned that he was a professional boxer. But when he first arrived in Hollywood in 1998, like many other young people, he nurtured another dream, to make it big on the screen. Quite quickly, he achieved a certain level of success in this field, landing a small role as a boxer in 1999. He handled it excellently, but something strange happened behind the camera. He behaved distantly, maybe even a bit shy, and didn't talk to anyone, keeping to himself. He seemed to have two sides to his personality. On one side, he was a clumsy guy with a lot of insecurities, but upon closer acquaintance, it became clear, if he wanted something, he would achieve it at any cost, shutting off all emotions. Michael had even once been arrested for theft. And it was this manner of behavior that puzzled Ashley and her friends. Ashley was a beauty, always open to communication, but Michael never invited her on a date or flirted with her. It seemed as if he was interested not in her, but in the lifestyle she led. Hanging out with actors like Vin Diesel and Jeremy Sisto, he became fixated on her. This wasn't particularly strange in itself, but one time, Ashley's friend Justin caught Michael sitting in his car at night across from her house, watching her apartment. The next day, when Michael dropped by, Justin directly asked him what it all meant. Michael's response shocked him. He allegedly couldn't go home because FBI agents from Chicago were waiting there to take DNA samples from him in connection with the murder of his best friend's girlfriend. Naturally, Justin suggested that Michael give a DNA sample if he had nothing to hide. Unexpectedly, Michael put his foot on the couch and showed a knife in a sheath, hinting that he was involved in the murder. Justin got angry and kicked the guy out of the house. Ashley and her friends brushed off Michael's story as another one of his tall tales. But what no one knew at the time was that it was true. Besides being an aspiring actor, amateur boxer, and heating repairman, Michael Gargiulo was also the prime suspect in the murder of Trisha Pacaccio. When Michael Gargiulo left Chicago, Illinois, he surely thought he was leaving the murder of Trisha far behind. But wherever he went, a new body would appear. In 2005, 12 years after Trisha's murder and 4 years after Ashley's death, Gargiulo was living in the Los Angeles suburb of El Monte. By this time, the cases of both Ashley and Trisha had been largely forgotten, but by a sinister twist of fate, yet another young woman was found dead in her apartment just steps away from Gargiulo's new residence. 32-year-old Maria Bruno had come to the United States from El Salvador and married young. Maria and her husband were raising 2 children, aged 4 and 5, and one set of twins when they made the difficult decision to separate. The children stayed with their father while Maria adjusted to her new life. One fateful day, an unknown assailant removed the protective screen from the kitchen window of her ground-floor apartment, grabbed a knife right there on the spot, and entered the bedroom where she was peacefully sleeping. A woman of delicate build, defenseless, she lay asleep in the bedroom of her apartment, the very place where she should have felt completely safe. This attack was a nightmare for any woman, but it also became a nightmare for any detective because the perpetrator left behind a horrific scene. The ferocity with which the unknown attacker assaulted Maria was phenomenal. Investigators quickly ruled out robbery and a sexual motive. As with Ashley, Maria had no enemies capable of such an act. But this time, the assailant left something behind. Near the apartment, forensic experts found a booty with a drop of Maria's blood and an unknown person's DNA on it. This was both a clue and a dead end. No other evidence was found. Detectives, Mark Littlefield, immediately realized that investigating this case would be challenging. What they couldn't know at that moment was that another woman would have to face the killer to solve this crime. On April 28th at 12:30 a.m., a call came into the police reporting a stabbing. The victim was 26-year-old Michelle Murphy. On that day, she was alone in her apartment because her roommate was away. The story of what she went through sounds eerily familiar, but this woman was not ready to give up without a fight. At around 11:40 p.m., an intruder entered her apartment through a slightly open window. Once inside, he opened the front door, preparing an escape route. He then calmly walked to the bedroom. The man simply began stabbing Michelle, managing to strike her several times in the chest, shoulder, and right arm. Michelle woke up to the blows being inflicted by the intruder looming over her. For a moment, she didn't know whether it was a dream or if it was really happening. Realizing that she was in mortal danger, she tried to wrest the knife from him. She continued to attempt to grab the weapon, even as her hands bled from deep wounds. For a while, Michelle and the intruder struggled until she managed to pull her legs up to her chest and push him away. Understanding that he couldn't overpower Michelle, the intruder fled, not forgetting to say, "I'm sorry," before leaving. The perpetrator managed to escape before the police arrived, but during the struggle with Michelle, he cut himself with his own knife, leaving a long trail of blood as he fled. About 25 days after the detective sent the blood sample to the lab, forensic experts reported a DNA match. The DNA matched Michael Gargiulo perfectly. Within 24 hours, Gargiulo was arrested and charged with attempted murder. What stunned the detectives was where he lived, right across the street from Michelle. But Gargiulo's arrest for the attack on Michelle was only the beginning. The investigation would finally connect a series of unsolved murders that had begun 15 years earlier. It was evident that Michael Gargiulo wasn't particularly surprised when he was arrested by Sergeant Richard Lewis for the attempted murder of Michelle on the evening of June 6, 2008, as he specifically asked which department the officers represented. The fact that he wasn't sure which crime he was being arrested for was intriguing in itself. His question had a basis, as Michael Gargiulo's DNA had been found in the national database. It was entered there by the Cook County Police in Illinois. The Santa Monica detectives contacted Illinois investigators to find out why they had done so and learned that Gargiulo was suspected of murder. The Santa Monica investigators discovered that in 2002, Cook County Police, who had continued to investigate the Trisha Pacaccio case, asked the Los Angeles police for help in obtaining Michael's DNA. By an amazing coincidence, they approached Detective Tom Small, who was investigating Gargiulo's involvement in the murder of Ashley Ellerin. It took the detective over a year to locate the elusive air conditioning repairman, linking him to Trisha's case. And 5 years later, that very DNA sample would help connect Gargiulo to the attack in Santa Monica. But that was far from the end of the story. The Santa Monica investigators called the El Monte police, suspecting that the attack on Michelle might be related to the murder of Maria Bruno. The El Monte detectives returned to Gargiulo's old apartment to search it and found the missing shoe cover. The unknown DNA found on one shoe cover also matched Gargiulo. With the necessary evidence in hand, the detectives had no doubt about the identity of the killer. The Los Angeles prosecutor decided that there was enough evidence to start a case against Michael Gargiulo. On September 4, 2008, while Mike was in jail for the attack in Santa Monica, he was charged with the additional murders of Ashley and Maria. However, the California investigators could not find an answer to one question. Why didn't the Cook County Police in Illinois arrest him years ago for Trisha's murder, thus preventing the deaths of 2 more girls? After all, in 2003, the police had linked the DNA sample obtained by Los Angeles detectives to the unknown DNA found under Trisha's nails. These were the pieces of evidence that could have helped arrest him. Even Trisha's family was confident that this was solid evidence, but the prosecutor decided not to open the case, arguing that the DNA alone was not enough to prove that Gargiulo was at the crime scene when Trisha was attacked. The DNA could have been left not only during the struggle for her life, but also after a casual touch. Mike was a family friend and often visited the house, which was the main obstacle in accusing Mike of Trisha's murder. The prosecutor's office explained that since the lab used one swab to collect DNA from Trisha's nails, it was impossible to determine whether the DNA was on the nails or under them. The difference in this case was enormous. A simple but evidently imperfect laboratory procedure tied the prosecutor's hands. Michael wasn't charged with Trisha's murder until 2011, when a man who worked as a bouncer at a Los Angeles nightclub with Gargiulo recalled seeing him in the news and remembered that Gargiulo had boasted to him and another club employee about killing a girl in Chicago. Gargiulo did not mince words, describing how he committed the crime and allowed her father to find her on the doorstep. After receiving the men's testimonies, the Illinois prosecutor charged Michael Gargiulo with Trisha's murder. This was the news the Piccaccio family had been waiting to hear for 18 years. It didn't ease their pain, but the thought that the guilty party would be punished brought some relief. Gargiulo, evidently doubting that he would be found innocent, planned to escape from El Monte jail. He made makeshift handcuffs out of plastic and intended to attack a guard, steal a police car, and flee to Mexico. However, his plan failed, and he spent several years in Los Angeles jail awaiting trial. After several delays, the trial began on May 2, 2019. It lasted 3.5 months, with over 200 people testifying. Among them was Ashton Kutcher, who recounted the night 18 years ago when he arrived at Ashley Ellerin's door moments after she had been killed. Kutcher testified clearly and directly. He had met Ashley 2 months earlier at a friend's party. At that time, he was in a relationship, but by the time Ashley invited him to her housewarming party 2 weeks later, he had broken up with his girlfriend. Ashley was also single, so Ashton asked her out to dinner. He arrived at her place quite late because he had been watching the Grammy Awards with friends. When Ashley didn't open the door, he simply went home. Upon learning that she had been murdered, Ashton immediately called the police and informed them that his fingerprints were on her door. Michelle Murphy also testified. She recalled the night of the attack and then spoke about the immense happiness she felt when she became a mother after everything that had happened. However, all she could think about were the parents of Trisha, Ashley, and Maria, whose daughters had been so heartlessly taken from them by this monster. After giving her testimony, she went downstairs to her husband, hugged him, and cried. Gargiulo's lawyer built his defense on the claim that his client was mentally ill and did not understand what he was doing. However, the prosecution proved that Gargiulo had stalked his victims for a long time, waited for the right moment to attack, and planned each assault meticulously, knowing how to avoid punishment. This indicated that he knew exactly what he was doing. Additionally, a former friend of Michael's testified that Gargiulo frequently searched the internet for information on forensics and how to evade punishment for crimes. The prosecutor argued that there was indeed an intimate component to his attacks, even though he did not sexually assault the women. It was the killings themselves that brought him pleasure. On August 15, 2019, Michael Gargiulo was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On July 16, 2021, he was sentenced to the highest penalty. He will be extradited to Illinois, where he will face trial for the murder of Trisha Piccaccio. In Illinois, the punishment for first-degree murder ranges from 25 years to life imprisonment. The psychologist who was asked to analyze Gargiulo's attacks stated that the similarities between the crimes allowed for identifying the characteristic features of his murders. First and foremost, there was the audacity of the attacks. He did not strike in the dead of night, but chose times when neighbors or passers-by could see him. Additionally, attacking with a knife involved very close contact, allowing him to look his victims in the eyes. What he did to the young women allowed him to strip them of their identity and humiliate their human dignity. The psychologist suggests that since they were neighbors and he could frequently observe the beautiful women, he put them on a pedestal. At the same time, he harbored a kind of contempt for them because he desired them, which gave the women power over him. Gargiulo felt the need to rectify this situation. He believed he could regain control only in the most horrifying way, not just by killing them, but by stripping away all their humanity. During one of the interrogations, Michael remarked that just because 10 women were killed and his DNA was found on them, it didn't mean he had killed anyone. This statement, along with testimonies from other witnesses, led the police to suspect that Michael might be responsible for the deaths of 10 people, even though he is officially accused of only 4 attacks. Since Michael Gargiulo traveled between Illinois and California, detectives believe there could be more victims.
Heroes, as we know, are not born. Circumstances forced a 12-year-old boy to grow up quickly when his father suffered a heart attack right on a busy highway. In 2009, young Daniel Marsh and his dad, Bill, were driving when suddenly, Bill clutched his chest and slowly leaned back in his seat. He was facing certain death, either from the heart attack or a catastrophic car crash. But as soon as Daniel realized something was wrong with his father, he grabbed the steering wheel and brought the car to a stop on the side of the road. Fortunately, Daniel's presence of mind didn't leave him after that. What would any other child have done in his place? Burst into tears, frantically tried to call their mother, or dialed emergency services? Not Daniel. He continuously pounded on his father's chest, and after 30 seconds, the man regained consciousness. In the blink of an eye, the boy became a hero and a celebrity in his hometown. After receiving an award from the American Red Cross for keeping his composure in such a dire situation and saving his father's life, there wasn't a single newspaper in the country that didn't write about Daniel Marsh. Who could have imagined that just 4 years later, the boy would shock all of America once again? Welcome to Davis, California, a city founded in 1868 and regarded as one of the best places to live in the state. This reputation was one of the reasons Claudia Mumpin, a beloved mother and grandmother, moved there. She devoted much of her time to the local theater and church. Another reason she ended up in Davis was her desire to find love again. Having gone through 2 divorces, she was searching for her soulmate, and she found him at the local church. Claudia met Oliver Northup, affectionately known as Chip, who also had a few marriages behind him. 11 years her senior, Oliver was a successful attorney, a talented musician, and a World War II veteran, making him a beloved and respected member of the community. Both their families were overjoyed when Oliver and Claudia decided to marry in 1996. It was a union filled with happiness. Who could have imagined that Claudia and Oliver would become the victims of a horrific crime in one of California's safest cities? On the night of Saturday, April 13, 2013, the couple said goodnight to each other for the last time. The next morning, they were expected at church, but they never showed up. Their families found this odd. Oliver's daughter tried calling their mobile phones, but both went straight to voicemail. Assuming the elderly couple had simply overslept, their relatives decided to let them be. However, Oliver was a member of a folk music group, and when he didn't show up for rehearsal, his son Robert decided to check on him at home. No one answered the door when he rang the bell. Respecting the couple's privacy, Robert, who had a spare key, chose not to use it. He convinced himself they had simply gone away for a weekend getaway. By evening, Claudia's stepdaughter, Laura, also grew concerned and drove over to the house. She rang the doorbell but had no key with her. After waiting for a few moments, she decided to climb the steps and peer through the windows. As she walked toward the back of the house, she noticed an open window and a cut screen. A chilling sense of dread overcame her. She was now certain something terrible had happened. When Laura looked inside, she saw a horrifying scene she would never forget. She immediately called the police and informed the rest of the family. The residents of Davis were horrified. They couldn't fathom who could commit such a brutal murder of 2 beloved community members, and most importantly, why. Nothing was stolen from the house. There were no signs of a robbery. The perpetrator or perpetrators left behind no fingerprints, DNA, shoe prints, or any evidence the police could work with. The crime seemed utterly senseless, which meant that a cold-blooded killer was still at large. While many in the town avoided speaking their fears aloud, everyone silently wondered, who will be next? Investigators hoped that the gruesome injuries and brutal experiments inflicted on the victims would provide clues to the killer's identity, but they were left puzzled, unable to make sense of the horrifying details. If there was a solution to this mystery, it seemed beyond their reach. The FBI flooded the city with agents, but even the Bureau's profilers were stumped. They couldn't determine if the killer had acted alone or had an accomplice. It began to seem as though a perfect crime had been committed. Gradually, investigators started to suspect someone close to Oliver and Claudia. The theory seemed plausible given the unimaginable cruelty of the murders and the use of a knife. Additionally, agents hypothesized that the perpetrator had likely used a key to enter the house and had cut the screen on the window as a diversion to mislead investigators. With suspicion falling on the victim's family, the police began calling in their relatives for questioning, one by one. Detectives methodically interviewed members of the large family, finding no red flags, until they turned their attention to Robert and his teenage sons, Oliver and Tony. On the first day, the three were interrogated for 8 hours, and on the next, for 6, sometimes without an attorney present. Exhausted but cooperative, they understood that their father and grandfather, himself a lawyer, would have wanted them to assist the police. All three answered questions willingly, confident they had nothing to hide, but naturally the boys were nervous. Oliver in particular struggled due to his schizophrenia. Tony too had reasons to worry. Investigators had discovered a strange drawing by him depicting a man holding a knife, standing over 2 children sleeping in their beds. The picture was more a silly doodle drawn during a phone call than a sinister fantasy, but detectives latched onto it. Additionally, police learned that on the very day of the murders, Robert had taken carpets to be cleaned. He insisted it was mere coincidence. After all, how could he have known that his father would be murdered the same day he decided to clean his rugs? The entire family rallied around the 3 men, asserting that their relationships with Oliver and Claudia were excellent and that none of them had ever shown signs of aggression. Robert's family spent thousands of dollars hiring a lawyer for Tony and repairing their home after police searched it and found nothing. Still, the ordeal left deep scars, particularly on Tony, who felt wrongfully accused. Even when all suspicion was cleared, Tony struggled with the judgmental looks of acquaintances and neighbors, who continued to blame him for what had happened to his grandfather. 3 years after the tragic deaths of Oliver and Claudia, the family would suffer another devastating loss. They would lose Tony as well. For 2 months, detectives believed the murder had been committed perfectly. But one evening, everything changed. The police received a phone call. The caller requested to remain anonymous, but later it was revealed that the boy's name was Alvaro Garibay. He was a 17-year-old student at Davis High School and claimed that his best friend had committed the double murder. This information stunned and intrigued the investigators. It didn't match anything they had suspected. When Garibay was asked why he hadn't reported it earlier, he explained that he had feared for his family and his own life. He said Daniel Marsh had told him that he was willing to kill again. The name of the killer was already familiar to the police. It had been in the public eye several years earlier, but not for any criminal activities. On the contrary, the now 15-year-old Daniel Marsh had been considered a hero after saving his father's life, receiving an award from the American Red Cross. Investigators were shocked that anyone would accuse the boy of murder, especially given his heroic actions 4 years earlier. No one had expected that the brutal killer of an elderly couple could be a teenager, certainly not a teenager who had once been hailed as a hero. When the murders occurred, Daniel's father, Bill Marsh, lived nearby, just down the street from his ex-wife and their children. Bill had specifically moved there to be closer to his son and daughter. While interviewing neighbors, the police knocked on Bill's door. Bill, recovering from back surgery, explained that he had just moved in and had not yet met the neighbors. 2 weeks later, he unexpectedly moved out, citing the inability to afford the rent anymore. Neighbors informed the police of Bill's sudden, suspicious move, but detectives didn't pay much attention to it. If not for Alvaro's phone call, the investigators might never have connected Daniel to the crime. Alvaro admitted that his friend had often talked about killing people, but he had never taken him seriously. However, 2 months ago, Daniel not only claimed to have killed the elderly couple, but also invited Alvaro over to his house, where he showed him blood-stained gloves, a jacket, a ski mask, shoes, and a large knife. At that point, Alvaro, still a teenager himself, didn't know what to think. Meanwhile, Daniel had confided in his girlfriend about the crime, but she didn't believe him, though she was frightened by his behavior. On June 4th, the girlfriend broke up with Daniel, and 2 weeks later, he broke into her house through a doggy door. It's unclear what he might have done if he hadn't been caught. The girlfriend told Alvaro about the incident, and Alvaro shared his suspicions with Bill Marsh, but Bill didn't believe him, or at least pretended not to. In any case, Alvaro felt he had no other choice but to take matters into his own hands and called the police. On June 17, 2013, Daniel Marsh was brought to the police station for questioning. Initially, Daniel appeared completely calm. He denied any involvement in the crime, claiming he was just a teenager who wouldn't harm anyone. However, after 3.5 hours, his composure began to crack. The teenager admitted that he had always felt like an outcast and a loner. Daniel revealed that his mother had left his father for his kindergarten teacher, a decision that deeply affected him. Alvaro had already informed the police that Daniel despised this woman and blamed her for his parents' divorce. He had even confessed to his friend that he wanted to strangle her. Over the years, anger had built up inside him, occasionally erupting in self-harm, as evidenced by scars on his left arm. At just 15 years old, Daniel was willing to go to extreme lengths to feel anything at all. He had even starved himself, leading to a stay in a clinic for anorexia. While he had recovered from the eating disorder, his overwhelming rage persisted. Though Daniel didn't initially admit to the murders of Oliver and Claudia, he revealed a disturbing pattern of thoughts. He described how every time he looked at someone, vivid images of killing them flashed through his mind. When one of the agents asked Daniel how he would kill him, Daniel responded without hesitation. He listed a chilling series of options, such as strangling the agent with his own tie, smashing his head against a mirror, attacking him with a shard of glass once it broke, and finally finishing him off by slamming him into a wall. Then looking the agent in the eye, Daniel added coldly, "Nothing personal." When the agent abruptly asked Daniel when he had started planning the murder of the elderly couple living nearby, the teenager smirked. Realizing there was no point in denying it any longer, he began to recount the horrifying events of that night. Investigators finally learned what had happened on April 13, 2013. By this time, Daniel Marsh had spent years consumed by dark fantasies of violence and decided it was time to act on them. That night, he dressed in black clothing, donned gloves and a ski mask, taped the soles of his shoes to prevent leaving traces, and armed himself with a large knife. Between 2 and 3 a.m. on April 14th, he set out into the quiet streets, intent on finding a target. Daniel walked past 40 to 50 houses, looking for an open door or window. In California, where many residents sleep with their windows open, he eventually found his opportunity. The home belonged to Oliver Northup, 87, and Claudia Maupin, 76, who lived just down the street from him. Using his knife, Daniel cut the screen of an open window and slipped inside. He found himself in the living room and waited, listening carefully until he heard the sound of snoring from the bedroom. Quietly making his way toward the noise, he discovered the couple asleep. Daniel had assumed he would only find one person, but realizing there were two did not deter him. For 10 long minutes, he stood over the sleeping couple, deliberating on how to execute his plan. He felt nervous, but also exhilarated. Suddenly, Claudia woke up and screamed. Without hesitation, Daniel stabbed her, unleashing a frenzied attack that continued for what seemed like an eternity. By the time he was done, he had stabbed Oliver and Claudia a total of 127 times. He continued to mutilate their bodies long after they were dead. The brutality did not end there. Daniel proceeded to desecrate the corpses, inserting a phone and a drinking glass into their bodies. Later, he confessed that this was an attempt to confuse the investigation, a tactic that had indeed delayed his capture for months. This chilling level of calculation and violence left investigators stunned and the community reeling in horror. Due to the severity of the crime, the prosecutor decided to try Daniel as an adult. The boy attempted to claim innocence, citing that he suffered from a mental disorder. However, a forensic psychiatric evaluation revealed that Daniel was not mentally ill. According to expert Matthew Logan, the 15-year-old boy was a psychopath, scoring 35.6 out of 40 on the corresponding checklist. For context, Ted Bundy scored 39 out of 40, and Aileen Wuornos scored 32. Before his arrest, Daniel was already looking for his next victim, wandering the streets with a baseball bat, as he wanted to commit his next crime in that way. The jury found him guilty of 2 first-degree murders. For each, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison, plus an additional 2 years for the particular cruelty of his crime. He will first be eligible for parole in June 2037, One might think the families of the victims could find solace, but a new law soon changed the situation. The law stipulated that only a judge could decide whether a juvenile could be tried as an adult. As a result, Daniel's case was reconsidered, and if the judge had disagreed with the prosecutor's decision, Daniel could have been released as early as age 25. Fortunately, the judge upheld the prosecutor's ruling. However, the surprises in the legal system did not end there. In September 2018, the governor of California signed a law prohibiting the trial of 14 and 15-year-olds as adults, regardless of the severity of their crimes. This meant that Daniel once again had the chance to be released, this time as early as May 2022. The victims' families launched a campaign to prevent Daniel's release. This is not a teenager who needs a second chance. This is a man who knew what he was doing and admitted he would do it again, declared Victoria Hurd, Claudia's daughter. Even in prison, he tattooed the images of my mother's wounds on his torso, she said indignantly. For several months, Claudia and Oliver's relatives anxiously awaited the decision on Daniel Marsh's appeal. To their relief, it was denied. The criminal will remain in prison and continue serving his sentence. Thus, a hero turned into a villain. This was the story of Claudia Maupin and Oliver Northup's deaths at the hands of an extraordinary killer, a 15-year-old boy who, just 4 years earlier, had saved a life instead of taking one.